Niti Aayog. It's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome all of you here. I have particular honor in welcoming the Honorable Chief Justice of India, Shri T.S. Thakur. He is also the chief patron of this conference, and he has really driven this conference from the front, and he's built a very homogeneous team which has worked very hard for this conference. I have great pleasure in welcoming the Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, Dr. Arvind Panagaria. The member, Mr. Ramesh Chand. I have great pleasure in welcoming the Honorable Chief Justices of Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, who are here with us today. We welcome you to this gathering here. We have great pleasure in welcoming all the honorable judges of the Supreme Court. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, as we advance towards the closing of day one, the inaugural session, we have one last parting gift for you tonight. The finishing canter, if you will, the much-awaited dinner speech. Our speaker for tonight doesn't need any introduction, especially before this kind of an august gathering. But he recalls in his autobiography that once a colleague of his confused his ancestry with that of the Azerbaijani Bolshevik revolutionary Nariman Narimanov. So let me take this opportunity tonight to set the records straight. This charming Parsi gentleman is good with many things, particularly so with words. He never ceases to impress his audience with his eloquence. Having chosen law, apparently his last refuge, he went on to do his LLB from Government Law College, Bombay. After passing out of college, he finally joined the chambers of Shri Jamshedji Kanga in Bombay High Court. There, his immediate seniors included the likes of Nani Palkiwala and H.M. Sirvai. Pretty much a lethal cocktail of legal luminaries, if you ask me. This legal eagle has had an illustrious professional career spanning more than half a century. A vanguard of Indian constitutional jurisprudence, he's been a very, very strong advocate against excesses during the darkest hours of India's democracy. Besides being a tremendously successful professional, he has been one of India's finest jurists. From arbitration to constitutional law, from company law to tort, this man has left his intellectual imprints in every nook and corner of Indian legal jurisprudence. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have with us the legend of the Indian legal profession. Please welcome Mr. Fali Sam Nariman. We are extremely grateful to Mr. Nariman for his guidance in conceptualizing this conference and for agreeing to give the dinner speech tonight. Without further ado, I would request Mr. Nariman to kindly take the podium. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Amitabh. You do extremely well in court. He has a very loud voice, and you require a very loud voice in court. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, that covers, I think, everybody. About a month ago, at a similar function like this, when my wife and I were there, and I was supposed to be the speaker of the evening, the chairman, like Amitabh, leaned over whilst everyone was having a drink and having a very nice time, that Mr. Nariman, would you like to start now, or shall we let them enjoy themselves a little more? So I am very sorry that you are not going to enjoy yourselves too much, but I won't keep you for more than a few minutes. You will find from the program that I'm slated as the after-dinner speaker. But I must tell you, at least our foreign guests must know, that an after-dinner speech is fraught with the greatest of dangers. Because we Indians, once we are fed and well fed, we just noisily go home. And that puts an end to your after-dinner speech. So the organizers have, very correctly I think, preponed this so that you can perhaps sip your drinks, not too loudly, and let your mobile phones ring. I'm not a very stickler, I don't bother. You can have your mobile phones ring as much as you like. But I will tell you what a playful and yet profound Italian journalist told his audience in New Delhi, this very city, a few months ago. His name is Umberto Eco, and his lecture was a very serious one on cultural anthropology. The report of it in the newspapers the next morning said he had demystified culture and left everybody with an unbearable lightness of being. But this is how he did it. He began his lecture by saying, ladies and gentlemen, there are only 3 categories of people who need mobile phones. 1, plumbers. 2, doctors. And 3, adulterous people. And he went on, since I know that none of you are in the first 2 categories, if your mobile phone does ring, I will know who you are. And believe me, the lecture, which lasted over an hour, was listened to without any electronic interruption. But I can assure you that what I am about to say won't last more than 10 or 15 minutes. So ladies and gentlemen, let your mobile phones ring, but give me your ears. Now a bit of serious stuff, so you better remain a little quiet. The conference tomorrow and the half day thereafter is on arbitration and varied aspects of it. Hopefully you may or you may not be interested in one or more of the subjects specially chosen. But even if you are not, let me tell you, the object and purpose of this conference, it is simply this, that one should never stop thinking about ways to improve arbitration. Arbitration and how it is conducted is the one subject that needs perennial scrutiny. It is today burdened with far too many practicing lawyers, that is, lawyers practicing in court and then occasionally, if time permits, making their appearance before arbitrators. Arbitrations are also beset, and this, you'll pardon me for saying this, with too many retired judges, a few of whom, whilst arbitrating, do precisely what they used to do when sitting and deciding cases in court. With respect, the wrong approach. You have to say with respect, then it's all right. Then you are pardoned. So seriously, ladies and gentlemen, arbitration must shed its extremely heavy baggage of lawyers and legalese. As to the public perception of lawyers, I have a good friend in the United States, Mark Gallanter, professor of law, and he provides me with a feedback from time to time. He often visits India and updates me with the current joke about lawyers. When he was last here a few months ago, he told us the current Q&A of doing the rounds in the US, a country with the largest single population of lawyers. So to the question, what do you say to 5,000 lawyers being dropped to the bottom of the deepest ocean? And the answer is, that's a damn good start. So such is a perception of jolly American lawyers about their own colleagues. But in India, where we have the largest population of lawyers outside the United States, many people, many reasonable people and intelligent people go to lawyers with the same hesitation, the same distaste, and with roughly the same lack of confidence as they go to public hospitals. They go only because they have to. And we must ask ourselves why. The reason is, and this is serious stuff, we keep the law and all its mumbo-jumbo as the sole preserve of the lawyer, not only in courts, but in arbitrations as well. A leading English arbitrator, Ken Rockison, Queen's Counsel records, that in his first arbitration appeal before the General Produce Brokers Association in England, this is how the chairman opened the arbitration proceeding. He said, "Gentlemen, this is a commercial arbitration, and we are going to hold it in a commercial manner. First of all, we will only hear the parties on the facts, and only then, if necessary, we will hear the lawyers." He writes that he, together with all other lawyers present, were taken aback. But on reflection, as he puts it, the proposal was full of practical common sense. Yes, that we want much more practical common sense in arbitration. Arbitration as it is conducted today lacks common sense. It has evoked too many complaints. Another good friend, Rusty Park, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's a fantastic human being, Professor William Park of Boston Law School, arbitrator emeritus, loves to tell a story about international arbitration, which he probably invented himself. And this is how it goes. There is a sign in the window of a shoe repair shop in downtown Boston. It is run by a Greek immigrant who is fed up with customer complaints. So he puts up the following sign in a triangle. 1, fast service. This side of the triangle, low price. Third side, high quality. And beneath that is written, pick any two. All three together can never go together. Fast service, low price, and high quality. This is the tragedy of international commercial arbitration, even with all the complex rules that your arbitration institutions come up with. Fast service can be achieved when mandated, as the latest amendment to our 1996 Act shows. But high quality and low price, that simply refuses to go together. Or perhaps that is because parties want big names. I have noticed this in other jurisdictions. There are many of the smaller chaps, I assure you, who do as well as some of us high up in the hierarchy do. The chaps high up in the hierarchy are somewhat affectionately and not too affectionately known as the mafia. And I always advise boards of arbitral institutions to pick as chairman not a mafia boss, but from lesser fry, more efficient, having more time, giving both fast service and high quality, and perhaps low cost as well. But merely prescribing for costs, like the new fourth schedule in our 1996 Act, will not solve anything. It is like the story of the Indian tourist who goes to a dentist in London to have his tooth extracted because it is hurting him to distraction. He first asks the doctor, "Doc, tell me how long will it take to remove it? And next, tell me how much it will cost." The doctor breezily says, "Only a couple of minutes, and it will cost you 300 pounds. What? 300 pounds for the work of a couple of minutes? Without batting an eyelid, the doctor says, "Well, if you like, I could do it slowly." So like that dentist, there are some arbitrators we know, we won't name them, who do it slowly, painfully slowly. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, it costs a bomb. But seriously, the real trouble in international commercial arbitration is that too few disputes settle. And too many that don't settle drag on for far too long. Too few disputes settle because arbitrators are a bit feisty. They don't step off their role of arbitrator on a high pedestal. They cannot stoop to assume the role of a mediator, even though our law encourages it. And I believe we must all have a real response to the changing environment in which arbitration is at present conducted. We have to encourage, not dispute resolution. We must initiate dispute avoidance groups, both in India and around the world, as independent entities and as teams functioning within large corporations. Professor Martin Hunter, whom many of you know, a great friend of India, he's authored the most prized book on international commercial arbitration. He prophetically foresees what he calls a new breed of lawyers becoming actively involved, not in deciding disputes, but in preventing potential disputes getting out of hand before they mature into intractable situations. And he ends with a hope that the next generation of international trade lawyers will be in a position to take a constructive part in these developments. We must resist what he characterizes as the overwhelming instinct in all of today's arbitrations, which, as he puts it rather crudely, is to screw the other side. Let's face it, this is really what all present-day arbitration is now reduced to, screwing the other side. One side must win all, the other side must lose all. Way back in 1946, a great American lawyer, John Davis, addressed the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. It's a speech worth listening to and reading. He said, and they are memorable words, "True, we build no bridges, we raise no towers, we construct no pictures. There is little of that, all that we do, which the eye of man can see. But we smooth out difficulties, we relieve stress, we correct mistakes, we take up other men's burdens, and by our efforts we make possible the peaceful life of men in a peaceful state." A few years later, Sir Michael Carr, founder of the LCIA, the London Court, who unfolded the vision of John Davis to a world conference, not of lawyers, but of arbitrators. He applied that description of lawyers to arbitrators. You must smooth out difficulties, relieve stress, correct mistakes, take up other men's burdens, and by your efforts make possible the peaceful life of men in a peaceful state. These elegant words help to ennoble this activity, which we all routinely partake in, and which we continue to call by the humdrum name International Commercial Arbitration. Now, I know you're getting bored, so I must stop now. I hate preaching because I know how it feels to be preached to. Whenever I say something pompous or pontifical, as I have said just now, my wife always reminds me of a sentence in a famous letter of the Oliver Cromwell written to the parishioners of the Church of Scotland. And I remember it not because my wife tells me, but because one of the judges of our Supreme Court always kept quoting it in his judgments. This is what Oliver Cromwell wrote 2 centuries ago, as Justice Krishna kept reminding us in some of his 700-odd judgments. This is how the quote goes. "I beseech you, in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken." Yes, so after making all these pontifical statements, always remind yourself that you might be mistaken. And to atone for something that I have said that is too clever, permit me to end with a story of why and how it does not pay to be too clever. Now please listen to this story. If you've heard it before, don't say you've heard it before. It is my favorite story. One night, a Delta twin-engine plane is flying somewhere above New Jersey in the United States. Just twin-engine. There are 4 people on board. The pilot, Bill Gates, the Dalai Lama, and a hippie who has boarded with his backpack. Suddenly, an oxygen generator explodes loudly in the luggage compartment and the passenger cabin begins to fill with smoke. The cockpit door opens, the pilot bursts into the compartment. "Gentlemen," he begins, "I have good news and bad news. The bad news is we are about to crash in New Jersey. But the good news is that there are 3 parachutes and I have one of them." With that, the pilot throws open the door and jumps out from the plane. Bill Gates rises and says, "Gentlemen, I am the world's smartest man. The world needs smart men. I think the world's smartest man should have a parachute too." He grabs one and he jumps out. The Dalai Lama and the hippie look at each other. And the Dalai Lama says, "My son, I have lived a satisfying life. I have known the bliss of true enlightenment. You have your life ahead of you. Do you take the parachute? I will go down with the plane. The hippie smiles slowly and says, don't worry, Pop. The world's smartest man just jumped out wearing my backpack. And the moral of the story, every story has to have a moral. And the moral of the story is that tomorrow, when you speak, whether from the platform or from the floor, be smart in what you say, but don't be too smart. And also don't be too long. So have a nice dinner.